Artemis Fowl, Chapter 5, Part 2. Artemis had anticipated some technological advances, but nothing like the treasure trove of fairy hardware spread out on the four-wheel drive's dashboard. "Impressive," he murmured. "We could abort this mission right now and still make a fortune in patents." Artemis ran a handheld scanner bar over the unconscious elf's wristband. He then fed the fairy characters into his power book translator. "This is a locator of some kind. No doubt this leprechaun's comrades are tracking us right now." Butler swallowed. "Right now, sir?" "It would seem so, or at any rate, they're tracking the locator." Artemis stopped speaking suddenly, his eyes losing focus as the electricity in his cranium sparked off another brainwave. "Butler?" The manservant felt his pulse quicken. He knew that tone. Something was afoot. "Yes, Artemis?" "That Japanese whaler, the one seized by the port authorities, is she still tied up at the docks?" Butler nodded. "Yes, I believe so." Artemis twirled the locator's band around his index finger. "Good. Take us down there. I believe it's time to let our diminutive friends know exactly who they're dealing with." Root rubber-stamped his own reactivation with remarkable speed, very unusual for LEP under management. Generally, it took months and several mind-crushing dull meetings to approve any application to the recon squad. Luckily, Root had a bit of influence with the commander. It felt good to be back in a field uniform, and Root even managed to convince himself that the jumpsuit was no tighter around the middle than it used to be. The bulge, he rationalized, was caused by all the new equipment they jammed into these things. Personally, Root had no time for gadgetry. The only items the commander was interested in were the wings on his back and the multi-phase, water-cooled, tri-barreled blaster strapped to his hip. The most powerful production handgun under the world. Old, to be sure, but it had seen Root through a dozen firefights, and it made him feel like a field officer again. The nearest chute to Holly's position was E1, Terra. Not exactly an ideal location for a stealth mission, but with barely 2 hours of moon time left, there was no time for an overground jaunt. If there was to be any chance of sorting out this mess before sunrise, speed was of all essence. He commandeered the E1 shuttle for his team, bumping a tour group that had apparently been online for 2 years. "Tough nuggets," Root growled at the holiday rep. "And what's more, I'm shutting down all non-essential flights until the present crisis is past." "And when might that be?" squeaked the irate gnome, brandishing a notebook as though she were prepared to make a complaint of some kind. Root spat out the butt of his cigar, squashing it comprehensively beneath his boot heel. The symbolism was all too obvious. "The chutes will be opened, madam, when I feel like it," growled the commander. "And if you and your fluorescent uniform don't get out of my way, I'll yank your operating license and have you thrown into the cells for obstructing a LEP officer." The holiday rep wilted before him and slunk back into line, wishing her uniform wasn't quite so pink. Foley was waiting at the pod. Serious though the moment was, he couldn't resist an amused whinny at the sight of Root's belly wobbling ever so slightly in his clinging jumpsuit. "Are you sure about this, Commander? Generally, we allow only one passenger per pod." Excuse me, guys. "What do you mean?" snarled Root. "There is only one." Then he caught Foley's meaningful glance at his stomach. "Oh, ha ha. Very amusing. Keep it up, Foley. I have my limit, you know." But it was a hollow threat, and they both knew it. Not only had Foley built their communication network from scratch, but he was also a pioneer in the field of flare prediction. Without him, human technology could very easily catch up with the fairy brand. Root strapped himself into the pod. No half-century-old crafts for the commander. This baby was fresh off the assembly line. All silver and shiny, with new jagged fin stabilizers that was supposed to read the magma currents automatically. Foley's innovation, of course. For a century or so, his pod designs had leaned toward the futuristic. Plenty of neon and rubber. Lately, however, his sensibilities had become more retrospect. replacing the gadgetry with walnut dashes and leather upholster. Root found this old-style decor strangely comforting. He wrapped his fingers around the joystick and suddenly realized just how long it had been since he had ridden the hot shots. Foley noticed his discomfort. "Don't worry, Chief," he said, without the usual cynicism. "It's like riding a unicorn. You never forget." Root grunted, unconvinced. "Let's get this show on the road," he muttered, "before I change my mind." Foley hauled the door across until the suction ring took hold, sealing the portal with a pneumatic hiss. Root's face took on a green hue through the quartz pane. He didn't look too scary anymore. Quite the opposite, in fact. Artemis was performing a little field surgery on the ferry locator. It was no mean feat to alter some of the dimensions without destroying the mechanism. The technologies were most definitely incompatible. Imagine trying to perform open-heart surgery with a sledgehammer. The first problem was opening the cursed thing. The screw heads defied both flathead and Phillips screwdrivers. Even Artemis' extensive set of Allen wrenches were unable to find purchase in the tiny grooves. Think futuristic, Artemis told himself. Think advanced technology. It came to him after a few minutes of silent contemplation. Magnetic bolts. Obvious, really, but how to construct a revolving magnetic field in the back of a four-wheel drive? Impossible. The only thing for it was to chase the screws around manually with a domestic magnet. Artemis hunted the small magnet from its niche in the toolbox and applied both poles to the tiny screws. The negative side wiggled them slightly. It was enough to give Artemis some room to maneuver with needle-nose pliers, and he soon had the locator's panel disassembled before him. The circuitry was minute, and not a sign of a solder bead. They must use another form of binder. Perhaps if he had time, the principles of this device could be unraveled, but for now he would have to improvise. He would have to rely on the intentions of others, and if the people were anything like humans, they saw what they wanted to see. Artemis held the locator's face up to the cab's light. It was translucent, slightly polarized, but good enough. He nudged a slew of tiny shimmering wires aside, inserting a buttonhole camera in the space. He secured the P-side's transmitter with a dab of silicone. Crude but effective, hopefully. The magnetic screws refused to be coaxed back into their grooves without the proper tool, so Artemis was forced to glue them too. Messy, but it should suffice, provided the locator wasn't examined too closely, and if it was, well, he would only lose an advantage that he never expected to have in the first place. Butler knocked off his high beams as they entered the city limits. "Doc's coming up, Artemis," he said over his shoulder. "There's bound to be a custom and excise crew around somewhere." Artemis nodded. It made sense. The port was a thriving artery of illegal activity. Over 50% of the country's contraband made it ashore somewhere along this half-mile stretch. "A diversion then, Butler. 2 minutes are all I need." The manservant nodded thoughtfully. "The usual?" "I don't see why not. Knock yourself out, or rather don't." Artemis blinked. That was his second joke in recent times, and his first aloud. Better take care. This was no time for frivolity. The dockers were rolling cigarettes. It wasn't easy with fingers the size of lead bars, but they managed. And if a few strands of brown tobacco dropped to the rough flagstone, what of it? The pouches were available by the carton from a little man who didn't bother adding government tax to his prices. Butler strolled over to the men, his eyes shadowed beneath the brim of a watch cap. "Cold night," he said to the assembled groups. No one replied. Policemen came in all shapes and sizes. The bigger stranger persevered. "Even work is better than standing around in a frosty one like tonight." One of the workmen, a bit soft in the head, couldn't help nodding in agreement. A comrade drove an elbow into his ribs. "Still, though," continued the newcomer, "I don't suppose you girls ever did a decent day's work in your lives." Again, there was no reply. But this time it was because the dockers' mouths were hanging open in amazement. "Yup, you're a pathetic-looking bunch, all right," went on Butler blithely. "Oh, I've no doubt you would have passed as men during the famine, but by today's standards, you're little more than a pack of blouse-wearing weaklings." "Arrgh," said one of the dock hands. It was all he could manage. Butler raised an eyebrow. "Arrgh? Pathetic and inarticulate. Nice combination. Your mothers must be so proud. The stranger had crossed a sacred line. He had mentioned the men's mothers. Nothing could get him out of a beating now, not even the fact that he was obviously a simpleton, albeit a simpleton with a good vocabulary. The men stamped out their cigarettes and spread slowly into a semicircle. It was 6 against 1. You had to feel sorry for them. Butler wasn't finished yet. Now, before we get into anything, ladies, no scratching, no spitting, and no tattling to Mommy. It was the last straw. The men howled and attacked as one. If they had been paying any attention to their adversary in that moment before contact, they might have noticed that he shifted his weight to lower his center of gravity. They might also have seen that the hands he drew out of his pockets were the size and approximate shape of spades. But no one was paying attention to Butler, too busy watching their comrades, making sure they weren't alone in the assault. The thing about a diversion is that it has to be diverting. Big, crude, not Butler's style at all. He would have preferred to take those gentlemen out from 500 feet with a dart rifle. Failing that, if contact was absolutely necessary, a series of thumb jabs to the nerve cluster at the base of the neck would be his chosen modus operandi. Quiet as a whisper, but that would be defeating the purpose of the exercise. And so Butler went against his training, screaming like a demon and utilizing the most vulgar combat actions. Vulgar they may have been, but that's not to say they weren't effective. Perhaps a Shaolin priest could have anticipated some of the more exaggerated movements, but those men were hardly trained adversaries. In fairness, they weren't even completely sober. Butler dropped the first with a roundhouse punch. 2 more had their heads clapped together, cartoon style. The 4th was, to Butler's eternal shame, dispatched with a spinning kick. But the most ostentatious was saved for the last pair. The manservant rolled onto his back, caught them by the collars of their donkey jackets, and flipped them into Dublin harbor. Big splashes, plenty of wailing. Perfect. 2 headlights poked from the black shadow of a cargo container, and a government saloon screeched along the quay. As anticipated, a custom and excise team on stakeout. Butler grinned the grim satisfaction and ducked around the corner. He was long gone before the agents had flipped their badges or began inquiries. Not that their interrogations would yield much, because a house was hardly an adequate description to track him down. By the time Butler reached the car, Artemis had already returned from his mission. "Well done, old friend," he commented. "Although I'm certain your martial arts sensei is turning in his grave. A spitting kick? How could you?" Butler bit his tongue, reversed the 4-wheel drive off the wooden works. As they crossed the overpass, he couldn't resist glancing down at the chaos he had created. The government men were hauling a sodden docker from the polluted waters. Artemis had needed this diversion for something, but Butler knew there was no point in asking what. His employer did not share his plans with anyone until he thought the time was right, and if Artemis Fowl thought the time was right, then it usually was. We're going to stop there today.